So this is the last video on America's foreign policy between the world wars, and we know that ultimately America ended up in World War II, and so this video focuses on FDR's leadership during the 1930s and how the United States gradually transitioned from being isolationist through to joining World War II. So similarly to Wilson, who was the leader of the United States during World War I, FDR wanted to use America's power to maintain order, just because of the moral reasons, because of the principle of it, but he understood that he also needed public opinion, which was still very strongly isolationist, and so he knew that he wouldn't be able to achieve, enacting those principles, which he thought was the right thing to do. FDR's basic views were that isolationism is not a lasting policy, and because of the modernizing world and technology, America isn't actually as far away from everything as it used to be, and it's not as isolated as it used to be. And it's also important to maintain America's interests, obviously economic, overseas, and these were some reasons why he was very conscious of international affairs, and that was becoming to be his focus. So there were some neutrality acts that were passed in the mid-1930s, making it very clear that America wanted to remain neutral, because they could see the war clouds looming in Europe. And so the Neutrality Act of 1935 basically imposed a trade embargo on any warring nations, and it forbade American sale of war goods or ships from transporting munitions to belligerent, that means participating countries in war. So this was a very black and white decision that America would be completely neutral and not support any countries that were at war. And the Neutrality Act of 1936 forbade any loans to any warring countries as well. And so this made a fairly clear sort of line in the sand as to where America stood and their commitment to neutrality. However, in 1937 there was a third Neutrality Act, and this one was slightly different, and it was a response to the Spanish Civil War, which was happening in the mid-1930s, and Nazi Germany was a part of that, testing a lot of their military capabilities. And so this was where basically goods from the US were allowed to be sold to warring countries as long as they paid for them the goods up front. And basically, why would Franklin Delano Roosevelt change his tune in 1937 and start to allow a certain amount of trade with these warring countries? And the reason was because his New Deal was starting to fail. So in 1937 there was that Roosevelt recession where the New Deal policies were starting to fall flat, and he now saw a good opportunity for America to start making back some of that money, and that's why the Neutrality Act, you can see, is starting to loosen up now as America heads towards World War II. And so heading towards the end of the 1930s and into 1940, there was a real debate between whether America should remain isolationist or become internationalist. And we've talked about all the reasons why America wanted to become isolationist and wanted to remain that way after the horrors of World War I. But there was a growing sort of public swing towards being internationalist because, they wanted to be, they could sense the unrest that Nazi Germany was causing, and they wanted to be preemptive. They wanted to be able to get in first and stop the war escalating out of control. And Roosevelt always had these moral obligations that he felt he needed to do the right thing and support the war, even though it was very hard to go against public opinion back home. There was a very staunch anti-war party set up, the America First Committee, and at its height had 800,000 members, and they were very strictly isolationist and wanted to put America's interests first before America took on this role as world policeman and headed towards World War II. So in 1940, Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided that he would run for a third term as president, which is unconstitutional. It had never been done before and has never been done since. And he saw that America was in a dire situation. There was a war in Europe. There was a brewing I guess, theatre of war happening in Asia as well. And he also wanted to see out some of his New Deal reforms as well, and so he decided that he would run for a third term, which he won. And after that third term, he started to take some serious steps towards preparing for the US entering World War II. So he won another very comfortable victory in his third term, as you can see here on the map. And he started to transition from being the New Deal president into a war leader. So in 1940, he asked Congress to allow for the trade of 50 US destroyers in exchange for 99-year leases for some British bases in the Atlantic. And although most of the population still did not support war and did not want to go to war, they did support US aid to Britain, so they did understand that we do not want to send our soldiers to war, but we do think it's the right thing to start supplying Britain and supporting them, especially after Britain was suffering some pretty heavy losses at the start of World War II, and Nazi Germany was gaining a lot of momentum. The US had used conscription several times before, but it had never conscripted in a time of peace. And technically in 1940, the US was still officially neutral. It still hadn't joined the war. And so this was an unusual situation. So around 16 million men were conscripted between the ages of 21 and 36, and they became eligible for compulsory military service. And you can see some of the terms for their service at the bottom there. In 1941, this is now a matter of months before America joined World War II, America offered a new program to Britain, the Lend-Lease Act, which basically was just a renewed system of giving a lot of America's surplus to Britain, and basically helping them out in any way they could. And this was another departure from the Neutrality Acts and another departure from isolationism. And America was very clearly and explicitly making war preparations in strengthening this alliance with Britain. In one of his fireside chats, which was one of his radio chats that FDR was famous for, he said the quote, "If your neighbour's house is on fire, you don't sell him a hose. You lend it to him and take it back after the fire is out." So it basically, it basically said that America needed to go and support Britain in their time of need. And even though America wasn't in the war in terms of its troops, it could be the arsenal of democracy, which means it could lend the Allied cause the weapons and the resources and the things that it needed to fight for democracy against Nazi Germany. In August 1941, which is still only a couple of months away from the US entering the war, FDR and Prime Minister Winston Churchill met and set up what's known as the Atlantic Charter, which is a series of, points and rules on their expectations of how the world should be run, and setting some very clear guidelines that was drawing America closer and closer to committing to World War II. And so there were 8 points in this Atlantic Charter that you can read through that were drafted out, basically all to do with freedom and going against all the things that Hitler was doing in Europe. And so those neutrality acts of the mid-1930s now effectively mean nothing, because there was this cash and carry and lend-lease programs that America was basically providing the United Kingdom and also France, and they were given all the resources and later weapons that they needed for World War II. The United States was also supplying aid and assistance to China as they struggled to keep out the aggressive Japanese as well in Asia. So there was always some contradictions underneath the surface, and it shows that FDR was preparing very actively for war. And lots of people criticised him, from not learning from the First World War, and America was spiralling and becoming increasingly entangled in this Second World War. Roosevelt issued his For Freedom speech as well. He believed and made this commitment to the freedom of speech, the freedom to worship God, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. And again, even though this is before America joined World War II, it shows that FDR, on an international stage, is making a commitment to freedom and to fighting the tyranny in Europe, only through words at this stage, but it shows the path that America is now on in stepping up as a world policeman, and it shows that they couldn't resist and couldn't sit back and watch what was happening in Europe anymore. They were very, very actively preparing to go to war. And so this, I guess, helped gain a lot of public support for the war cause. President Roosevelt drawing on the desperation and the need of Britain and France for America's help. And again, the war machine just kept building up. The peacetime draft was increased to 2 million troops. So this trend of militarism continued, and America was very ready to go to war, at the drop of a hat. Now we all see Pearl Harbor as the definitive event that catapulted America headlong into World War II when they were attacked by the Japanese. But leading up to that, America had actually imposed a fairly severe trade embargo on Japan. Roosevelt seized all Japanese assets in the United States in retaliation for the Japanese occupation in China and Southeast Asia. And Britain and the Dutch East Indies, which is Indonesia, they followed suit. And what happened was that Japan lost access to 3/4 of its overseas trade and almost 90% of its oil. And so we commonly think of Pearl Harbor as this starting point for World War II. But as you can see, FDR and America took lots of steps leading up to this. And this can be seen as economic warfare before the actual military warfare started on America. And so in some ways you can see Pearl Harbor is maybe a retaliation to America rather than this out of the blue attack, which we sometimes think of it as. And so I guess the end of isolationism officially comes with the US declaration of war after Pearl Harbor, but now the world enters a new chapter.